Let's do a pro photography review for the 16-inch MacBook Pro M3 Max SoC. This is Art is Right. Before we start, subscribe if you're new and hit on the bell icon so you'll be notified every time I upload cool new videos like this. Let's take a look at the M3 Max compared to the previous one and see how much of a generational improvement we're going to get. This way you can choose the best SoC for your workflow and determine if you want to upgrade or not. A big thank you and welcome to those of you who have already subscribed. If you haven't done so, please consider doing that because I'll be releasing streams of more testing videos in the next few days and you definitely don't want to miss those. Something that all of you can do to help me out is to hit on that like button because YouTube algorithm would then push this video to an even larger audience. I'll be sharing with you a lot of information. I highly encourage that you pause this video so you can analyze the result yourself in addition to the analysis I'll be sharing with you. Timestamp to the various tests will be in the description if you want to jump ahead. If you find information that I'm sharing with you helpful, please consider supporting the channel. Link to a tip jar will be in the description. You can use YouTube Super Thanks, and something new that I'm trying out is a membership to my channel. It's only $1 a month. You can cancel at any time, and you will get priority replies on any questions you ask in the comments. Now let's take a look at the M3 Max. For this, we are looking at 3 different machine configurations, and this is a little bit of an oddball configuration. Not all of them are stock, some of them have been upgraded, and we're looking at a 14 and 16 in combination, but these are the chip that I have in the studio, so this is how we're going to be testing them. So we have the M1 Max, which is the top SoC in the 16-inch. We have the M2 Max, which is the base SoC. This is in a 14-inch chassis, and for the 16-inch MacBook Pro, we are looking at the M3 Max top SoC. The first thing we're going to look at is the amount of CPU cores that it has. 10, and this is distributed differently in terms of performance and efficiency. 8 performance, 2 efficiency. When it comes to the M2 generation, we get 2 more efficiency core. And when it comes to the M3 Max generation, we are now getting even more bumps in the performance core by 4 more. So we are now starting to see a point in the Max where it's starting to deviate from the M1, M2 generation. Interestingly enough, for the M1, M2 generation, once we reach that max CPU core on the Pro SoC, that just pretty much remains the same for the Max, and the only variation we get is the GPU. Now, what Apple is really doing this time around is they're really tiering their chip in both the CPU and also the GPU on the system. As far as GPU go, we have gone from 32 cores down to 30 in the base. So on the top one, this is technically a 38, but I don't have that one, and this is a 40 GPU machine. There is 16 neural processing engine, and technically it's supposed to be faster in the M3 generation. I can't test this because all the apps that we're using right now doesn't really tap into that potential at all. As far as memory bandwidth go, all of them are 400 gigabytes per second, so they're pretty much on par with each other. Now, this machine memory has been upgraded from 32 gigabytes of memory, double that to 64. This is stock, and this stock is 48 gigabytes of memory. So there are some interesting memory configuration in this new M3 generation. All right. Something that I want to point out is that with the current chip that I have, the top M3 Max, you can choose between 48, 64, and 128. The option for 36 and 96 is pretty much grayed out. Those options are technically only for the base M3 Max SoC. So choose wisely what you want to do. There are a couple of thoughts that I have on this. I'll share with you later in the video. Now, the interesting thing about this new M3 Max generation is that the CPU and GPU core is really pushing that close to the M1 Ultra chip. And it's also consuming less power than M1 Ultra as well. This is really amazing. Now, as I already pointed out, for the M3 Max, there are 2 variations of the SoC, and here are some additional test systems. Now, I just recently released a video comparing all these 3 machines together on the M3 Pro versus the rest of them. I'll leave a link to that video in the description. I'm not going to go over this much because I talk about this extensively in the other videos already. One thing that I want to point out briefly is that the memory bandwidth between all these machines doesn't really matter much because I have demonstrated this in the M1 generation with the Pro chip at 32 gigabytes of memory and the Max chip at 32 gigabytes of memory. At that one, we're looking at 200 versus 400 gigabytes per second. The reality right now is that none of our apps are really going in to utilize the CPU, GPU, and NPU all at the same time while saturating memory to really utilize all that bandwidth yet. So it'll be a while before the apps catch up to what Apple have done architecturally, and that's also the reason why in this generation we're seeing Apple cutting back on that because it's just really not necessary. It seems like a downgrade, but we're not even using half of that to even start out with. All right, there are some additional test systems that we're going to be showing the data for. This would be the M1 Ultra, M2 Ultra, and also the 13-inch MacBook Pro, M1 and M2, and the M3 14-inch MacBook Pro test will be coming out soon as well, so stay tuned for that. And there's also a surprise result I'll sprinkle in every now and then. This is the Razer Blade 18, and I'll leave a link to this test video in the description too if you want to check that out. There are obviously more videos coming in this channel, as you can see right here. These are only a sample of a few of the videos that are going to be coming, and I'll be releasing them pretty much daily at this point until we flush this cycle out. All right, so interestingly enough, in this cycle of testing, this M3 Max is within reach of the M1 Ultra in many of the tests you're going to see. If you're coming from an Intel machine, this is a huge leap forward, and Apple is really pushing. So for anyone that has an Intel Mac right now, they can really consider upgrading to the Apple Silicon, and for a lot of good reasons. I'm just going to point out the space back looks really cool on these machines, and that's all I'm going to say. The Thunderbolt and USB on all these machines, including the Pro and the Max, are all on a separate bus. So even though you may see 2 ports on the side, all of those are on individual bus, which is a good thing. And another thing I want to point out as well is that I have retested everything. So all the numbers that you're seeing are on the current operating system, Sonoma 14.1 or 14.1.1, and all the current app generations that are being utilized today that we have access to. Some of the testing observations is that none of the machine have throttle, even though the fan has gone into what I call a fan ensemble, because I have multiple machines running and literally all of them are going all high speed at once, which is rather interesting. I have noticed that in this generation, the M3, the fan tends to kick out a lot more and runs a lot louder than the M1 and M2 generation in the past. So something interesting to note there. And all of my machines have shipped with macOS Sonoma instead of Ventura, because there were some talks online that some of the machines ship with Ventura, but that's not been my observation. So display brightness on this, we definitely have a 20% brighter max 600 SDR. Doesn't really matter much unless you use the display in the bright environment all the time. Now, a few things I want to cover is that display calibration for both the internal XDR display and also external hardware calibrated display works just fine. So Calibrite Profile, it works without any problem. BenQ Palette Master Ultimate works on all the M variants. So M3, M3 Pro, M3 Max, I've tested all of those. All right, so this is going to be a photo review, and I am doing a single app testing because I want to see how the silicon is performing from one generation to the next. We all multitask, and if you're going to multitask, just get more RAM for your system. That is all I'm going to say about that. As far as test configuration go, there is really no way for me to test every single variant of these machines. So most of the time, I am going to stick with stock unless I already have the machine in the studio. But a lot of these we can really extrapolate the data. And another thing I also want to point out is that this is a 3rd generation testing these. The effect of RAM and SSD on this system is already known, and we can definitely extrapolate how we are going to utilize the system and which resources is being used. This way you can choose the best for your workflow. This is how you're going to read the spec for the machine. I'll leave a link to this as well if you want to come back to it, and all the abbreviation and pretty much what it means. All right, SSD. So the one thing I want to point out on this is that the storage inside the machine internally, this is pretty much fixed. You cannot upgrade it afterwards. However, what you can do is expand this by plugging in an external drive, SSD, a DAS or NAS, and so forth. So with SSD, you don't necessarily have to configure it for the fastest one or get a large one because you want a higher speed, because I'm going to show you in these tests, it doesn't really matter much when you have these SSD speed already. I still see people commenting on my videos saying like, oh, it's a little bit slower. Like, so what? It doesn't really impede the performance in many of these heavy tasks that I am really showing you right now. The other thing that I also want to point out with these Mac machine is that there is a high power mode, and apparently this is also in both the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro with the M3 Max. At this point, you can go into the battery setting, and on the battery part, you can set whether you want to run in low power, automatic, or high power, and on power adapter, you can do pretty much the same thing as you are pretty much seeing there. Now, based on my testing in the past and in numerous testing, different operating system and so forth, I haven't seen any improvement in the photo apps or any apps I'm testing here. My recommendation is just set this on automatic. This way the system can balance the energy usage and the power of the machine to the best of its ability. Putting it into high power mode does not necessarily mean it's going to export faster, but it will definitely consume a little bit more energy when on battery power. That is something that I definitely have observed. So recommendation, forget about this, leave it on auto. All right, SSD speed, comparing all these machines together, this is what we're looking at. It's pretty much the same as the previous Max generation. Not that big of a deal at all. Here it is, the data compare with the rest of the machine, and these are more than mighty fast for any type of pro workflow. Now, the thing that some of you may be asking is that asset, the images, video files, stored internally versus externally, does that really make a difference? Well, I made a video answering that question. The answer to that is really nil. It doesn't have any difference whatsoever, but I'll leave a link to that video in the description so you can see the chart and the testing methodology so you can validate that yourself. RAM. When it comes to memory on these systems, there's a couple of things I want to share. Consider your use case and the modality really well. If you're like me, you're crazy, you have multiple browsers running with too many tabs open, multiple applications running, you want to configure your system with more RAM. This way it runs faster, it doesn't slow down, and you have more room for all these apps to really run at its most efficient. Remember, that is non-upgradable. The moment you configure it, that is pretty much all you're going to get, and there is no way to expand this. So you cannot plug in an extra RAM like you can with an SSD. You cannot do that. The last thing that I want to say is this is a unified memory, meaning that it is shared between CPU and GPU. It is managed really well. It is really fast. However, I hear some saying that less memory on these unified memory is more. Less is not more. Less is still less. More is more. So if you think you're going to need more, configure this with more memory on your system. A few things that you can do, especially if you are Creative Pro, you're already on a Mac. Restart your current system now. Launch the Pro app and launch Activity Monitor. Go into the Memory tab. Take a look at the memory pressure. If you're green when you're running all these heavy tasks, take a peek of it every now and then. You're good. The amount of memory you have is fine. If you're in the yellow, you might want to consider bumping up memory. If you're in the red, definitely get more memory in your system. And the usage of memory in your system will compound over time as well. So another thing to think about. I use iStat menu to keep track of my memory usage. That's something to consider and think about. The other thing is that I recommend getting at least 32 gigabytes of memory for Pro. This is not going to be a problem in any of these machines because it comes with 32 gigabytes on the Max anyway. In fact, the top Max M3 SoC that I shows also comes with 48 gigabytes memory, so you are good there. But the one thing that I do want to point out is that the OS is already using memory. So you're not just dedicating that memory to just pretty much the app and the CPU and GPU, you're sharing that with the operating system, and anything else that you have on the system running will also use more memory as well. So just do yourself the favor. If you want to have a really good working experience, upgrade the memory is something that's going to benefit you most. Lightroom Classic 13.0.1 full acceleration on Sonoma. Let's take a look at some of the results. So starting out, this is a reference data. Now, some have commented that I'm testing a very old camera file. So pretty much I'm using the Mac Studio M2 Ultra, and this is showing the export time between the D850, Nikon Z9, high efficiency compressed, and Sony A7R5 lossless large. This is a 60 megapixel camera, and this is the 1:1 preview for all of this. So you can see how the time is really scaling there. Now let's take a look at the 1:1 preview on these M3 Max machine compared to the rest. All right. Now what we're really getting here is a huge performance improvement. This is something that looks really awesome. This is probably one of the very first time that I would probably say, hey, you know what? The Max machine, it's looking really compelling compared to the previous generation Max, because there is, again, the CPU core bump in addition to the GPU core. And this is really just a CPU task, but it's showing us a few things. It's showing us that the CPU is faster than the previous generation, and it's also more core count as well. So Lightroom is running way faster on this. Now, one thing that I want to point out is that Apple have said that it could be up to 80% faster than the M1 and 50% faster than the M2 and the Max variety of the chip. Are we really seeing that right now? I would say that we're seeing a little bit like in the 55% or so. We're not really seeing up to 80, but this is a good enough number we can see, and it's definitely faster than the M2 generation. So this is something really promising, and based on what Apple's testing is really showing there. This is how this pretty much scales with the rest, and interesting enough, the M3 Max is within a striking distance of the M1 Ultra and is fairly close to the M2 Ultra. Go figure. right? I mean, it's really interesting there. Now, the interesting thing about all of this is that you can now get the M1 Ultra, this machine configuration, cheaper than you can get the M3 Max nowadays. So if you have an external display and you're okay with getting a desktop, the M1 Ultra is still an amazingly great value, especially in the world we are today. This is another reference result, and Mac Studio M2 Ultra, this is the exporting for 1000 file Nikon D850, C9 compress, and also Sony A7 R5, 16 megapixel file. This is just to give you a reference chart to give you an idea. Now, this is a task that use a lot of CPU and GPU in combination together, and we're seeing some improvement here. But we're not really seeing the huge improvement, and interestingly enough, on this machine, the 14-inch MacBook Pro M2 Max, because it has a little bit less core, the memory a little bit less on the system, is showing some slight slowdown compared to the rest in the lineup. Now, like I said, this is a machine I have in the studio, so we're using this. But I want to point out one thing though. What Apple has said is that it's up to 50% faster than the M1 Max and 20% faster than the M2 Max. So let's take a look. Are we really seeing the 50% faster? I mean, we're not really quite seeing that. We're seeing about 30%, but even though they say up to, so we're not going to hold them fully accountable for that, but we're really seeing that right now. As far as the M2 Max go, this is also not the top number of GPU on there, which could be up to like 38. So this is really kind of showing the result, but it's giving us an idea as far as how these systems are scaling. M3 Max is again pretty much sitting there right there at the very top, although it's not really quite close to the M1 Ultra and the M2 Ultra just yet, but it's pretty much getting there. So this is giving you an idea, but like I said, the M1 Ultra right now is such an amazing value machine because you can get that for cheaper than the M3 Max at this point. All right, Lightroom Classic HDR merge. This is taking 9 Nikon D810 file, merging it together. And what we're seeing is that the Max and the Pro performance are very similar in the M3 generation. This is pretty much just going and utilizing one or maybe like two CPU core at the very most, and it is much faster, or you know, I would say much faster. These are all relative, but they are definitely faster than these other machines in a lineup there. So a lot of things to consider. What about a panorama merge? Taking 14 Nikon D810 and putting this together into a 314 megapixel file, DNG file. So for this, we're seeing the timing. Interestingly enough, this is the slowest, but it also have the least amount of memory. So the more memory you give to this task, the faster it does become. Now, the one thing that this machine have working for it is that it has more CPU core, and even though it doesn't have 64 gigabytes of memory, it is pretty much within striking distance of the M1 when it upgrades 64 gigabytes memory. Two things this is really telling us. The machine, M3 Max, performing really well. It's a really fast machine, and even with less memory, it can still do the task just fine. This is also telling us that, hey, if you have the M1 Max and you upgrade to 64 gigabytes of memory, that machine is also no slouch. How about this compared to the rest in the lineup? So when we take a look at this, the M3 Max is just a little bit slower by about a second. I'm going to attribute it to a margin of error, but this is not that much faster than the M1 Ultra and the M2 Ultra. So again, within striking distance of the super high-end SoC from Apple. A lot of interesting results there. Lightroom Classic AI noise reduction. This is Nikon D810. This is still a GPU-based task. This is supposed to be using the NPU. However, there are artifacts and color shifting that happens from this, and they haven't really been utilizing that yet. So taking a look at this, well, the number of GPU cores is supposed to tell you how this is going to perform, but interestingly enough, the 14-inch MacBook Pro with less GPU cores performing faster than the 32 GPU core, and this one is pretty much still sits at the very top. This is good result to see overall, but again, you're only talking about a few seconds apart, and I don't think that is really that big of a deal. 5 seconds faster than the M1 Max. Comparing this to the rest though, this is pretty much sitting within the doorstep of the M1 Ultra and M2 Ultra. So those machines, even though it has pretty much way more cores, it's not really being utilized that much more than what it is here. Now, when it gets to use the NPU, that might be a different story because the Max only have 16, whereas, for instance, the M2 Ultra has double that to 32 core NPU. So we're gonna have to see if that is going to be an improvement or not when this process is running on the neural processing engine. Lightroom 7, full acceleration. Export time. This is pretty much the one using CPU, GPU, and RAM all in combination. And it is really fast. So this combination is a pretty good powerhouse if you use Lightroom CC. Now, most of us don't use Lightroom CC, however, there are some, so that's why I'm showing this. And the other thing that I want to show this is because Lightroom CC export algorithm is generally going to be step ahead of Lightroom Classic. Sometimes they'll tune Lightroom Classic so that it's good and it's better in Lightroom CC, and then the next release, Lightroom CC, it's pretty much back up again, doing a much better job. So this is giving us an idea, and this machine, the M2 Max one, is a little bit slower because it has less GPU on the system and also less RAM as well. Comparing this with the rest in the lineup, and we can see that the M3 Max is pretty much almost right there to the M1 Ultra, to the M2 Ultra machine. Very interesting result. It doesn't really quite beat it out yet though, so interesting stuff there. Capture One 23 version 16.3.0.76. I wish that was in binary, that would be hilarious. Capture One import time. This is pretty much what we were seeing in the M3 Pro test that I've done, is that slope. It is faster, but it's not significantly faster. Part of this is because Capture One doesn't really go in and utilize that much CPU in the system at all. It's not really maxing it out, it's just utilizing it. And there is definitely a point of diminishing return, as you're going to see in the next slide. And this is the point of diminishing return, meaning that I have the M2 Ultra with 40 CPU, and it's slower than this machine with a 16 CPU core. How is that even possible? In what world does that even make sense? It does make sense, by the way, because I did test this, and this has been consistent through multiple generations already. We need an improvement, right? For example, 20 CPU core in the M1 Ultra is performing clustered in the middle of this graph. Rather disappointing. Anyway, Capture One export. Now this is really going in to use the GPU and pretty much GPU only, but with Capture One, there's a point of diminishing return. And interestingly enough, having a machine with less GPU core in the M2 Max generation, it's doing really well. It's 19 minutes, 7 seconds. It's a little bit slower than this, but this is telling you that, hey, you know what? Maybe the M2 Max generation is a good machine, especially if you just run Capture One and that's your sole program you're running with. As far as how much faster this is compared to the M1 Max, well, not by much at all, actually, only a few minutes at the very most. Interestingly enough, this sits at the very top, followed by the M2 Max, and the Ultras are coming in behind. They are clustering together, but there are some slight trailings behind there. And this just really shows you that Capture One doesn't really go in and utilize the system resources that are available in the system. As much as the OS is doing a lot of hefty lifting, the program itself need to be able to communicate in an efficient and optimized manner to the operating system as well, so that the operating system knows what to utilize on the hardware that is on the system. Otherwise, we're just using brute force and we are just wasting resources. Photoshop. For this, I am still using Lloyd Chamber Digital Lloyd Test. Link to his website will be in the description. I also have a commercial license to the Puget System Test. We're not going to use that just yet because they are still in beta for Apple Silicon. I'm waiting until at least it is in the latest beta, or it is in the full release version. This way, the benchmark result and number will remain consistent, so it can be more of a generational test. And this will cover for both Mac and PC, which is a great thing. These are the tests that I'm doing from Digital Lloyd, and these are the comparisons. So the M3 Max and M3 Pro are performing just about the same there. You can see there are really fast cores compared to the rest. Even though I say really fast, they are just about a second apart. It's really no big deal. But if you do Photoshop, this may be the consideration that you want to make now, is to get the M3 generation, because it's going to improve in those minor increments that might make your workflow a little bit easier. Now, when it comes to the Photoshop Medium, 15.7 gigabytes, think about this for a second. If you have a 16 gigabytes of memory in your system, close to half of that is being used by the operating system, more is being used by Photoshop, and then it has to go into scratch disk. So this is pretty much filling up the memory on the 16 gigabyte machinery. Something that you're going to note there is that the 16 gigabyte machine are performing just about the same there. They're clustering, they're taking a little bit longer, but the moment we bump this up to a higher memory on the system, well, we're starting to see something different. This 15.7 does not fill in this 48, and combine this with the faster CPU core, we are now getting performance that are even slightly faster than the M1 Ultra and also the M2 Ultra with 70%. With 90% of memory allocated, performance is very similar still. I mean, timing is just about the same as what it was before, but it's very interesting to note there. One thing that I do want to point out in this chart is that the M3 Pro and the M3 Pro with the 70 and 90, something to note is the SSD speed. Everyone's been talking about this. Let me simply put it this way. With 70%, this number is supposed to be very long like this. It really makes a lot of sense. But if the SSD was really slow, then the previous generation of all these 512 gigabyte machine, it should have been longer, but it's not. And all these 512, even though it's a mix between M1, M2 generation, which are slightly slower in the M2, is still performing and clustering just about the same. Now, when we bump this up to 90%, that means that the system has access to an even larger allocation, this faster memory. You can see the timing pretty much goes down right there. So this is a machine with 18 gigabytes memory. So having that extra 2 gigabyte memory and also faster CPU core does benefit as well. Photoshop Huge, 56 gigabyte. This is beyond what most of us would do. This is something that Bert Monroy may do. And Bert, this is why he probably has the high memory count machine. But for most of us, we wouldn't be touching a file that would be even that large. And even if we do so, every occasionally, we're only waiting maybe about a minute or 2 minutes longer on a slower SSD. It's really not a big deal. A couple things that I do want to point out is that this is pretty much a function of memory going from 16 to 18, 32, 48, 64, and you can see there having more memory in the system is definitely speeding this task up, because if it's already filling memory, it has to cache to the slower SSD. Obviously, it's adding a little bit more time, and the M1 is a little bit faster. So yeah, SSD does play a role, but if you take a look at this, you're talking about less than a minute for like speed wise. It's not really that big of a deal at all. So everything is all in perspective and in relation to each other. Encoder decoder engine, Final Cut Pro 10.6.10. So with this, we're going to take a look at H.264, and I'm going to cut out the Razer machine because that just looks somewhat depressing when we talk about hardware encoding on those. So the M3 Max is pretty much clustering in the same as the M2 Max and the M1 Max. And some have asked, like, how does this edit on the timeline? Based on what I've been playing so far with this file that I'm working with, and I don't have that many like demanding effects and so forth, it's functioning just fine for me. But if you are the type of person that edits 8K and have more use, get more RAM, upgrade to the top chip. This is something that you're going to have to determine your workflow, and I can't really determine that for you. It's really workflow dependent, depending on what you do. But for me, this has been working just fine. And like I said, the encoder decoder engine is pretty much functioning as the same as the previous generation before it. HEVC H.265, the result, clustering right in about the same. This is pretty much the M3 Max, and it is within the Max territory as it was before. One thing that I point out in the previous video I released as well is this version of Final Cut Pro does improve the M1 Ultra export time, which is a good thing, and we have waited quite a while for us to really get that performance, and we didn't get that until even after like the M2 Ultra has already been on the market, so somewhat disappointing there. This is ProRes 422. Expand this graph a little bit more. M3 Max is pretty much sitting on the doorstep of the M1 Ultra, where the M2 Ultra is still a touch faster than the rest in the lineup. But this is also giving us an idea as well that when we have the M3 Ultra, that machine is going to be lightning fast. All right, Adobe After Effects benchmark. So for this H.264, this is the one that have gone in and enabled CPU and GPU. So this is using the hardware encoder engine on the Mercury that is using there. And we can see that the timing for this, when we combine CPU, GPU, and also the fact that we have a little bit less memory than even just like the Max, is performing really well. And you can see the slope there. In fact, it's about 50% faster than what have come before. This is really great number to see. And interesting enough, it's also even more than 50% compared to, for example, the M1 Max. So we're getting that number already that is close to getting that 80% when we're really going to use these tasks. It's not really quite there yet, but it's really getting up to that number. All right. One thing that I want to point out is that between the CPU and GPU export, the timing doesn't vary that much, and using GPU export in After Effects right now can cause artifacting and color rendition issues. So the recommendation is just to go in and use CPU for now, and the timing is not that much of a variation. Here it is compared to the rest. Interestingly enough, M3 Max, between the two, this is the GPU and CPU. Both of these are still beating out, for example, the Razer, but this is also telling you that the GPU render and the GPU speed is kind of like somewhat in the range of like the 4070, somewhat interesting there. And also it's beating out the M1 Ultra. The only one that's really at the top of the list right now is the M2 Ultra at this point in time, but we're only talking about like 4 seconds apart. That can easily be attributed to a margin of error. So what are some of my analysis, thoughts, and observation about all this? The first thing that I will say is that Apple have said that it's up to this much faster. So they're not saying it's going to be this much faster. And all this is really going to depend on the application that we use in real life. You're seeing the result right now. But what I can tell you is that this generation Max SoC is probably the most impressive that I have seen testing these machines. In the M1 Max, I didn't thought it was that impressive because the CPU core was the same. You only get the boost in GPU, and most of the apps back then aren't even using GPU that often. M2, yeah, you're still getting the same dilemma as the M1 generation, where this is really pulling ahead. Now, another thing we have to notice about this is that when it comes to the 16-inch model, there are 3 chip configurations we can choose. The Pro, that's going to be the top spec already, and the Max, you have the option between the base and the top one. And moving between the base and the top and also the Pro, you do get more CPU cores. So you're going from 12 to 14 to 16, and that's something good to see in addition to the GPU jump on the system. This is creating much more of a tier and a consideration for upgrading to a higher performance spec SoC. A few other things to note about this is that if you end up going with the M3 Max base, you only have the option to choose between 36 and 96 gigabytes of memory. So something that in the range of around 2.6 times more memory on the system. You cannot choose any of the in-between one. And if you choose the top M3 Max SoC, well, you now get the memory bump to 48 right away. So even though this is really telling you that the price variation is 300, you're kind of being lumped in together where the memory is 200, the chip itself is just only $100, but it's a combo upgrade that you don't have a choice to choose one or the other. Something interesting there. You can choose to go about 1.6 times more memory, and that will give you 64 gigabytes of memory, and you can choose to go a little bit over like 2.6 times or so, and that will give you 128 gigabytes of memory. This is now at the memory level of the M2 Ultra. So a lot of interesting stuff happening there. So one of the things that I said before is that based on this yearly product release cycle from Apple, from the operating system to the chip itself, there's a lot of catch up that the software developer have to do. They have to catch up on the OS, they have to catch up on the chip, and by the time they get to the point where they're catching up, not even optimizing, just catching up, a new one is already on the horizon, and they have to prepare to update those. So a lot of what we're really seeing right now are just really using brute force power to really go in and utilizing these machines. So the question is, should you upgrade? So I'm going to put it this way. If you're coming from an Intel machine, yes, any Apple Silicon will do much better than an Intel one, including even just the Mac Mini with the M1 chip, and you upgrade that to 16 gigabytes of memory, that's still going to be much faster because that machine was really close to rivaling the $12,000 Mac Pro with the Intel Xenon that I have at one point in my studio. So even getting that machine right now, which you can get for an amazing price, it's still going to be the Intel machine that you already have from before. Something to consider there. If you're coming from an Apple Silicon machine, this is really not an easy answer. It depends on, do you need to upgrade? What are the things you need to upgrade? If you need more RAM, then yeah, consider upgrading. If you need more SSD, internal storage, then consider upgrading. If you want just overall more CPU or more GPU core, or even faster one, then that may be a compelling reason to do so, especially if you're from the M1 generation. Now, if you're from the M2, I might just hold off a little bit. You know, it is an improvement and it is significant, but maybe it's something to hold off for now. So something to think about that. All right, here is an upgrade chart that I have. This is good, better, best based on the program that we have. And for a very long time, I am going to say that if you really want a good performance in Lightroom Classic, consider if you're on a laptop to go with the Max SoC, because these programs now utilize GPU on exporting and is definitely helping out a lot with a lot of speed and so forth. If you want the best performance, Ultra is still going to remain supreme. As far as Photoshop goes, I would say, yeah, definitely consider the M3 generation because of the increased frequency, the faster cores that you're going to get. And the other thing that you might want to do is simply go in and just upgrade the RAM. So for instance, if you go with the M3 Pro and just bump up the memory in your system, that can be a really good machine. As you've seen in the Photoshop test, between the Pro and the Max, it doesn't show that much variation. And I think you're going to be better off, for instance, with like the 3 generation machine. So something to think about there. And I might have arranged this ship in a slightly wrong way, so I have to rearrange the Photoshop ship a little bit more. So we'll take a look at that a little bit later. All right, when it comes to Capture One, I say that the M2 Max is probably going to be the best one at this point. And if you're choosing the M3 Max, I would just go with the base SoC for the Max. I wouldn't go with the top one because you're going to reach a point of diminishing return really quickly with Capture One. As far as Final Cut Pro go, seriously, I would just consider the Max or the Ultra because of the extra encoder decoder engine. That's going to save you a lot of time, even in just previewing or rendering the timeline that you have in your clips. So as usual, RAM minimum 1618, but if you can for Pro, the optimal is to go with 32 plus. All these machines in the Max lineup have more than 32, so we are good to go there. As far as SSD, 512 would be the minimum, 1 terabyte. But if you're choosing a Max, I mean, the stock configuration is a really great machine. Here is an upgrade path. If you want to consider upgrading this, one thing that you can do is take a screenshot of this, put a circle on the current silicon that you have and decide how you want to upgrade. For instance, if you have the M1 Pro, going to the M1 Ultra in a desktop format is a really great proposition. The price of this machine has come down by quite a bit. The performance is still pretty much up there, and you are getting a really amazing machine with a good price. Just have to bring your own display, mouse, and keyboard, and you'll be good. But if you want a laptop machine, well, there are other pathways you can upgrade, for example, to the M2 Max, or you can even jump and directly go to the M3 Max as well. There are so many different upgrade paths, but this gives you an idea a little bit as far as how you can move along in the Apple Silicon chart. I also want to point out that everything on the left side, the M1, M2, and M3, these are what I would consider to be consumer-oriented silicon, and anything with like the Pro, Max, or Ultra are going to be more for the pro-oriented workflow. So if you do any type of pro work, save yourself the time right now, pay just a touch more money and get at least a Pro chip because it's going to make a big difference in pro workflow. Anyway, like I said, M3 Max is probably one of the most impressive Max lineup that I have seen in this 3 generation. And the results in this testing should say everything there is about it. I'll be releasing more comparison videos and also more review of this lineup as well in this generation, so make sure you stay tuned to the channel for that. If you have any questions or comment, leave them below, give this a like, subscribe, and hit the bell, and